Hi guys, welcome to our second night looking at this book of Amos. Just a reminder that you can watch this talk obviously anytime, and then on Wednesday night at 7:30, we have our Zoom time together. Again, I'll send the link so that all you have to do is click on it to join the meeting. So we just had the introduction to the book of Amos last week, and we saw when it was written and who it was that wrote it, and it was indeed Amos. So I'm going to go on and look today at the next section of the book of Amos. It runs from Amos chapter 1 verse 3 right through to chapter 2 and verse 16. I'm sure you've heard the saying, you can't see the wood for the trees, which basically means you're looking at so much detail, or you're focused in on one or two things, trees in this instance, that you cannot understand or appreciate the size of the forest or the whole wood. And that's certainly true in terms of Bible study. Sometimes we can look so much for the detail and get caught up in the detail. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and some passages obviously are all about the detail. But sometimes we go into the detail without fully understanding or appreciate the general purpose of the book. And certainly that's true at the start of each passage to try to understand, or each book to try to understand what the context is. And we did a bit of that last week. But even when we look at passages, it's important that we read the passage maybe once or twice, just so that we can understand what the general picture is, and then we can look at the detail. So let's start by looking at a kind of introduction to these verses, say Amos chapter 3 to 2:16. And right at the start, I want to look at the kind of introduction that Amos uses. These two chapters are what's called the judgment of the nations. Remember last week we saw how there was Israel, made up of 10 of the tribes, and then underneath that was Judah, made up of the other two tribes. And they were two countries with two kings and two governments at this stage. And then around those two countries were a lot of other countries. And what Amos is doing here is mentioning all the countries all around Israel and Judah, so that his first message from God is about them. Now, I guess that's really helpful, and we'll come later to see why. But he starts each of those messages with the phrase, you'll see it in verse 3, for instance, for 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent. For 3 sins, or even 4, doesn't really make that much sense to me. Maybe it does to you. And he says at the start of each of the judgments. Verse 6 for Gaza, for 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4. And so on. Verse 9, for 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4. Verse 11, for 3 sins of Edom, even for 4. Verse 13, for 3 sins of Ammon, even for 4. Chapter 2 and verse 1, for 3 sins of Moab, even for 4. And what does that mean? What is he trying to say? Is it that God doesn't really get upset over 1 sin or 2 sin, but it's 3 sins, and then he really responds to the 4th sin? What is that about? Well, in order to understand any phrase that's used in the Bible, it's probably helpful to see and to read of where that phrase or kind of phrase was used before. And actually with 3 different kinds of, or 3 times in which this phrase was used in the Bible. The first one, if I can find it again. Yeah, the first one you'll find is in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 and verse 2. And the words here are, the words here are, give portions to 7, yes, to 8, for you do not know what disaster may come upon your land. And the idea here is that you never stop giving or doing good. You keep going with being generous. The second um, time that it's used is in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16. The words are, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. And again, the idea and suggestion of the use of these words is that we can't hide any sin from the view of God. God does not overlook any sins. He looks over all of them, and even the ones that you think he doesn't see, he sees those as well. And a third suggestion, the third reference is Job chapter 5 and verse 19. These words read, from 6 calamities he will rescue you, in 7 no harm will befall you. In other words, there'll be no end to the love and care that God shows to his servants. So this phrase at the start of each of the judgment is basically saying and underlining for each of the readers that for 3 sins or even for 4, there is no end to God's judgment. There's no end to God being concerned about the sins of the nations. And I guess that is almost contradicting the way of people at the moment, and sadly even some of the ways within the church in general, that we have decided as people that we don't necessarily need to take God's view or God's purpose or decision or rules that seriously. And how many times do we read and hear people even saying, that was for then, it's not for now. We've all grown up a little bit. That was just because people were immature. Or even to say things like, no, God couldn't judge, God couldn't condemn. He's a God of love. And sometimes we will accept the things that come our way if we like them, but we just think if anything is unpalatable, then we just won't accept them. And that's a big, big danger in looking at Bible and in understanding truth. So in general, what is going on in these judgments? Well, as we read through each of them, and you can read this in your own time, there are things that each of the nations of the world have done that have caused God's anger. And he says just after, for 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent. In other words, I will not give up on my judgment. And God is saying here that these things are serious. These things are important. I've seen them. I've seen how it has marred the nation, and I have brought judgment. And normally the kind of things, as I say, you can read through them to see the actual sin. But it's normally about theft, social justice. It's about violence. It's about looking down on women and greediness, all those kind of things in each of the nation that have had a history of attacking Israel and Judah. Let me show you the map. On this map, you can see the wee red circles that list or circle the areas, the nations that are mentioned. And you can imagine as the people of Israel there right in the center, or Judah down below them a little bit, what Amos was saying was just music to their ears. You see, Israel and Judah had been on the bad side of these nations. They had attacked them. They had stolen from them. They had killed their people. They'd been aggressors. And it's as if It's as if they were thinking, at last God is going to judge them and deal with them, deal with their sins. And as they go round, or he goes round the circle of nations, you can almost see the people ticking the list off of making sure that God was going to get every nation. And then the big shock comes whenever Amos speaks judgment to Judah and to Israel. They're being judged as well. They're being grouped alongside these other pagan nations. And that would be a real shock to them. And what does God say about Israel and about Judah? Well, they start off with Judah. And even Israel would be quite happy for Amos to be judging Judah, because Judah had been a fly in the ointment of Israel's way of going. They'd be quite happy to understand that Judah was being judged by God. They hadn't heard yet the judge that God was going to have for them. But this is what Judah is judged for. It's verse 7 of chapter 2. For 3 sins of Judah, even 4, I will not relent, because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his decrees. Because they have been led astray by false gods, the gods their ancestors followed, I will send fire on Judah that will consume the fortresses of Jerusalem. Each of the judgment follows the same pattern. There's the opening phrase for 3 sins, or even for 4, the name of the nation. The second phase is that God will not turn his back on their sins. He will not relent. The third bit is pointing out what the actual sin is. And then fourthly, there's the judgment. And for each of the nations, as you look through them in chapter 1 and 2, you'll see that Amos and his prophecies follow the same kind of routine. So Judah's sin was that they had rejected the law of the Lord. How could that be? Sure, Judah were the people of God. They're part of the special promised people for the promised land. How could God judge them? And yet they had. They had lessened their enthusiasm at best, or at worst, they had totally rejected the law that they once pinned everything on. Israel's judgment, verse 6. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl, and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines. There, Israel is having a real judgment that's more to do with social behavior, with morality, with greed. And Amos goes on in verse 10 to remind them, remember, I brought you out of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness to give you the land of the Amorites. And he rehearses what God had done for this people of Israel. And as you go on and read the rest of that passage, you get the finish of the judgment, and then you also get the judgment, the punishment. It's awful when you know you're going to be told off, isn't it? It's awful whenever, either because you recognize that you've done something wrong and they've caught up with you, or by the way someone walks into the room or addresses you, or you receive a letter that you know that you're going to get it. Israel and Judah were caught out here. They wouldn't have believed that God was going to do this because he was judging all the pagan nations, all the nations that God said he'd protect Israel and Judah from. And then came the judgment on Judah, a lesser one than Israel. God will not relent on the sin. One final point. Why does God do this? Why is there judgment and condemnation? How does that fit into grace? Well, you see, grace can only work when there is sin. If God just simply overlooked the sin, then everything about him, his ways, and the world would be lost. The fact is that God cannot turn his back on sin, but God has dealt with that, we know, through Jesus' death on the cross. It wasn't that he ignored sin, but he got the penalty that all of us deserve because of our sin. So God cannot tolerate sin. It cannot go unpunished. But the grace and love of God that was shown to Israel time and time again, and certainly to us, is that even though God cannot tolerate sin, it does not necessarily condemn us because of the grace of God. See if you have any questions, and I'll see you on the Zoom meeting on Wednesday. Good night.